In the summer of 2023, 3 men stood on a hillside in Maryland and tried to bend the course of history. The President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of South Korea. 3 nations that had spent the better part of a century as occupier and occupied, as rivals, as neighbors with every reason to distrust one another, and almost none to stand side by side. At Camp David, they signed what no one before them had managed, the first binding partnership to lash America, Japan, and Korea into a single line of defense, and they engineered it to outlast themselves. Annual summits written into the calendar, joint military drills across the sea and the sky, a crisis hotline, always open. Every piece bent to one purpose, to weld the alliance so tightly into place that no election, no successor, no shift of mood in any capital could ever pull it apart. They were building something meant to survive them. It survived them almost at once. Inside 18 months, all 3 were gone. Japan's Prime Minister resigned. South Korea's president declared martial law in the dead of night, sent soldiers into the streets of Seoul, and was impeached before the year was out. And in Washington, a new president walked back into the White House, one who looked at the alliances America had spent 80 years assembling and saw not shields to be maintained, but customers with an overdue bill. This is the story of an alliance built to be leader-proof, and the president who decided to put it on trial. Because today, the United States is demanding that South Korea pay roughly 5 times more to keep American troops on its soil. It is preparing to hand Japan the same invoice, and it has said aloud the one sentence an ally is never meant to hear: "Prove to us what you are worth." The timing could not be crueler. Beyond these 3 borders, the danger is compounding. North Korea is sending its own soldiers to kill and die in a European war, and carrying home Russian missile, submarine, and nuclear technology as payment. China is pressing on Taiwan harder than at any point in a generation. The exact threats that once forced these old enemies together have never loomed larger. And the hand now loosening the alliance belongs not to any of them, but to the country that forged it. So this is the question hanging over the future of Asia. The most consequential alliance on the continent is being tested, not by its enemies, but from within, by its own architect. Can a partnership between a transactional America, a nationalist Japan, and a divided Korea actually hold? Or was leader-proof a promise the world was never in a position to keep? To understand how much rides on the answer, we have to begin with a harder truth. This alliance should never have existed at all. Start with the wound. For 35 years, Korea did not exist on the map. From 1910 to 1945, it was a colony of Imperial Japan, not a neighbor, not a rival, a possession. Koreans were forced to take Japanese names. Their language was pushed out of the schools. Hundreds of thousands were conscripted into Japanese mines, factories, and battlefields as forced labor. And thousands of women and girls were taken into military brothels, the so-called comfort women, a soft phrase for one of the ugliest crimes of the war. When people say Japan and Korea are natural enemies, this is what they mean. It is not a rivalry. It is a colonizer and the colonized, and the memory is barely 3 generations old. Then, in 1965, the 2 countries tried to close the book. They signed a treaty to normalize relations, and Japan handed over a package worth about $500 million in grants and loans. For Tokyo, that was the end of it. Every claim, every debt of the colonial era, settled in full, in writing forever. But buried inside that deal was a fault line that would take 50 years to move. The victims themselves were never asked. 2 governments had reached over the heads of the people who had actually suffered and declared the matter closed. To Japan, the ledger was balanced. To many Koreans, justice had been signed away in a back room. That gap is where the alliance keeps splitting open. In 2018, it moved. South Korea's Supreme Court ruled that the 1965 treaty could not erase an individual's right to compensation, and ordered two Japanese companies, Nippon Steel and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, to pay surviving forced labor victims directly. To Seoul, it was a court defending the dignity of its own citizens. To Tokyo, it was a nation tearing up a signed agreement it had honored for half a century. Japan called the ruling totally unacceptable. And then it did something almost unheard of between two democracies, two advanced economies, two American allies. It went to economic war. In the summer of 2019, Japan reached for the supply lines of the Korean economy's crown jewel. It restricted the export of three chemicals: hydrogen fluoride, photoresist, and fluorinated polyamide. Obscure names that happen to be essential to making semiconductors, the computer chips that are South Korea's single largest export. Then it struck Korea from its list of trusted trading partners altogether. Seoul answered with boycotts of Japanese cars and beer, and then reached for its heaviest weapon. It threatened to walk away from the General Security of Military Information Agreement, GSOMIA. Strip away the name, and it is simply this: the deal that lets Japan and South Korea share military intelligence in real time. When North Korea launches a missile, this is the pact that lets Seoul and Tokyo see it together, in the same instant. Two neighbors under the same nuclear shadow. And Korea was ready to cut the one wire connecting their eyes, over a wound a century old. Washington watched, alarmed, as its two most important allies in Asia aimed weapons at each other's economies, while a real enemy built real missiles a few hundred miles away. Korea stepped back from the edge at the final hour and kept the agreement alive. But the lesson was carved in stone. This was the raw material history handed to the architects of the alliance. Not two partners hunting for a reason to cooperate, but two nations with a wound between them deep enough to override their own security. Any partnership built on this ground would have to be stronger than a grudge that had already outlived a century. So how do you weld two countries like this into a single team? You do not do it with goodwill. Goodwill was never enough. You do it with fear, a threat frightening enough to make old enemies forget for a while why they hate each other. And by 2023, they had three of them. If history said this alliance should never hold, geography said it had no choice. Look at where these three countries sit. Draw a small circle around Seoul, Tokyo, and the water between them, and you have outlined one of the most dangerous neighborhoods on Earth because of who lives next door. Start with North Korea. Not the punchline it is so often made into, but a nuclear-armed state run by a single family, sharing a land border with South Korea and a short missile flight from Japan. The numbers are estimates. Pyongyang shows the world only what it wants seen. But the consensus among analysts is sobering. North Korea is now believed to have assembled roughly 50 nuclear warheads, with enough fissile material for as many as 90. And its leader has ordered production pushed to what he calls an exponential pace. It has tested solid-fuel intercontinental missiles, the kind that can be hidden, moved and fired with almost no warning. And in 2025, it revealed its largest one yet. Much of this is still unproven. Its warheads have never flown a live test, and whether they could survive the heat of re-entry is genuinely uncertain. But you do not get to wait and find out. For Seoul and Tokyo, a single miscalculation is measured in minutes. That alone might be enough to force two enemies together. But North Korea is the smaller shadow. The larger one is China. In a single generation, it has built the world's largest navy and a military shaped above all for one purpose: to push the United States back from the Western Pacific and reorder Asia around Beijing. Its aircraft carriers now sail past Japan's southern islands into open ocean. Around Taiwan, the democratic island China has vowed to take by force if it must. Beijing sent more than 3,500 military flights in a single year, a record while rehearsing the blockade of an island that sits astride Japan's oil lifeline and a few hundred miles from Korea. For Japan, a China that controls those waters is an existential problem. For Korea, it is more complicated. China is also its largest trading partner, the customer it cannot afford to lose. And that one difference will matter enormously later. But for both, the direction is unmistakable. The balance of power in Asia is tilting, and it is not tilting their way. And then the two shadows merged. In 2024, North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense treaty and became something new, an axis with a war to fight. Pyongyang sent an estimated 15,000 soldiers to bleed for Russia on the battlefields of Ukraine, some in frontline roles, and in exchange, Moscow began feeding North Korea what it has always wanted most: advanced missile, submarine, and nuclear know-how, the very technology that could turn those unproven warheads into working ones. The threats that once stood apart, Pyongyang here, Moscow there, Beijing looming above, are no longer separate problems. They are becoming a single network. This is the arithmetic that overrides a century of grievance. Alone, each of these three democracies is exposed, a set of eyes that can see only so far, a hand that can reach only so far. Together, they can watch the whole neighborhood at once and answer it as one. Geography does not move. The missiles are real, and no amount of history between Seoul and Tokyo changes the fact that they stand under the same sky, inside the range of the same weapons. So the logic was always there. What was missing was the machine to make it permanent, something sturdier than a warm summit and a handshake that the next election could erase. In August of 2023, on that hillside in Maryland, three leaders finally tried to build it. For decades, American presidents had wanted this and never gotten it. The idea was obvious on paper. America's two most important allies in Asia, Japan and South Korea, sat almost within sight of one another, facing the same enemies, hosting the same American troops. If they would only work together, the United States would hold something close to an unbreakable position in the Pacific. Washington had pushed for it under president after president, and every time, the history you heard a moment ago pulled the two apart again. One insult, one court ruling, one bad news cycle, and the cooperation collapsed. So when the three leaders came to Camp David in August of 2023, they set out to solve a different problem than the one everyone was watching. The headlines were about North Korea and China. But the real target was time. How do you build something that survives the next quarrel between Seoul and Tokyo, and the next election in all three capitals? Their answer was to bury the alliance in routine. They did not sign a treaty. There was no grand mutual defense pledge, no promise to die for one another the way NATO members do. What they signed was quieter and, in a way, more clever. A schedule. From that point on, the three leaders would meet every year, automatically, the way the G7 or NATO does, whether they liked each other or not. Their foreign ministers, defense ministers, and security advisors would meet on a fixed calendar too. They launched a named annual three-way military exercise, Freedom Edge, so their forces would train together as a habit, not a gesture. They agreed to share missile warning data in real time, wiring their radars into a single picture of the sky. They built crisis hotlines, and at the center they placed something called the commitment to consult, a pledge that when a threat appears, the three will get on the phone and coordinate before they act, not after. Read the fine print, and you can see exactly what they were trying to do. Every piece was designed to convert a fragile friendship into infrastructure, into meetings that happen on their own, exercises already on the calendar, wires already connected. The bet was simple and audacious. If you make cooperation the default, the automatic setting, then even leaders who dislike each other, even governments that change hands, will find it easier to keep the machine running than to tear it down. They gave it a name that captured the ambition: the spirit of Camp David. Analysts called it historic. Some began, carefully, to describe it as the seed of an Asian mini-NATO. But look closely at what they did not build, because that is where this story turns. They did not make it a law. They did not make it binding. There was no treaty a Senate had to ratify, nothing a court would enforce. The whole structure rested on one assumption: that each of the three governments would keep choosing year after year to show up. It was a machine with no engine of its own. It ran on the willingness of whoever happened to be in charge. The architects were betting they had built something stronger than politics. Within a year and a half, all three of them would be gone, and the world would learn whether the bet was right. Every machine built to outlast its makers eventually faces the same test. What happens when the makers are gone? For the spirit of Camp David, that test came almost at once, and it came in triplicate. Start in Tokyo. Fumio Kishida, the Japanese Prime Minister who had taken the political risk of reaching toward Korea, watched his support sink under scandal and rising prices. In the autumn of 2024, he stepped aside. The man who had spent political capital he could barely afford in order to shake a Korean president's hand was simply gone, replaced within his own party by leaders who owed the trilateral project nothing. Then came the shock no one had scripted. In Seoul, on a December night in 2024, President Yoon Suk-yeol, the boldest champion of the alliance, the man who had absorbed enormous anger at home to reconcile with Japan, went on television and declared martial law. He sent soldiers toward the National Assembly. For a few hours, the democracy that anchored the alliance's Korean pillar stood at the edge of collapse. Lawmakers pushed past the troops to vote the order down. He was ultimately impeached for that unlawful martial law. Within months, the Constitutional Court removed him from office. And in June of 2025, South Korea elected a new president from the opposite side of its politics, Lee Jae-myung, a man who had long warned that Yoon leaned too far toward Tokyo and too hard against Beijing. And in Washington, the largest piece moved last. Joe Biden, the president who had convened Camp David and made the trilateral his signature achievement in Asia, handed the White House to Donald Trump, who viewed the entire architecture of American alliances not as an inheritance to protect, but as a set of deals to renegotiate. Stop and take in what had happened. In 18 months, all three of the leaders who signed the spirit of Camp David were gone. Every signature on that document now belonged to someone out of power. One had resigned. One had been impeached for trying to seize emergency powers. One had been replaced by his political opposite. If the alliance were a personal friendship, three men who happened to trust one another, it would have died right there, 3 times over. This was the exact moment the architects had feared and prepared for. This was the whole point of burying the alliance in routine. The automatic summits, the scheduled exercises, the wired-together radars. The machine was supposed to keep running even after every hand that built it had let go. So did it? Astonishingly, for a while, Yes. The successors, who owed the project nothing and had every reason to walk away, kept showing up. The meetings happened, the exercises sailed. On paper, the institution held. But that was before the real test arrived, because one of those three successors was not interested in inheriting the machine at all. He wanted to know what it cost, and whether the people it protected had been paying their share. The alliance had survived the loss of its makers. It was about to meet the man who would put a price on it. For 70 years, the American alliance system rested on an idea that was almost never said out loud: that the United States defended its allies not as a favor, but because those allies were the forward walls of America's own security, that a threat to Seoul or Tokyo was, in the long run, a threat to San Francisco. The troops in Korea and Japan were not rented muscle. They were the tripwire that kept America's wars far from American shores. The value was strategic, and it was assumed. The new doctrine coming out of Washington questions that assumption directly. It looks at the same troops, roughly 28,500 in South Korea, more than 50,000 in Japan, and asks a blunt question: what in dollars is America getting for this? If these allies are wealthy, and they are, both among the richest nations on Earth, why is the American taxpayer subsidizing their defense? Why not treat protection like any other service, with a price, an invoice, and a customer expected to pay? This is what people mean by a transactional alliance. And it is only fair to take the argument seriously, because it is not merely a whim. There is a real case underneath it. For decades, voices across the American political spectrum have argued that allies free ride, that they underspend on their own defense precisely because they know America will cover the gap. The numbers get cited. Allied economies that compete with American workers while leaning on a security guarantee paid for in American money, and potentially American lives. Seen from that chair, asking allies to pay more is not betrayal. It is overdue accounting. So the invoice came. In his first term, the president had already demanded that South Korea raise its payment for American troops fivefold, from around $1 billion a year toward $5 billion. Now the demand wears a different form, but points the same way. Pressure on Seoul to lift its defense spending toward nearly 4% of its entire economy, and to pay far more for the troops on its soil. Japan is told to expect the same conversation when its own agreement comes due. Trade is folded in, tariffs and troop costs bundled into one negotiation, defense and commerce fused into a single running bill. The message, stripped bare, is the sentence from the very start of this story. Prove to us what you are worth. And here is the danger the accounting misses. Deterrence is not a product. Its entire power lives in the enemy's belief that it is unconditional, that an attack on Seoul brings the full weight of the United States automatically, without hesitation, without a bill. The moment protection looks negotiable, the moment an adversary suspects the guarantee has a price and might go unpaid, it begins to lose the one quality that made it work. What holds North Korea or China back is not a signed page. It is certainty. And certainty is exactly what an argument over money erodes. This is the trap at the heart of the alliance's greatest test. Both things are true at once. It is reasonable to ask a wealthy ally to carry more of the load. And it is dangerous to make the world's most important security guarantee sound like a subscription that can lapse. The very act of pricing deterrence can weaken it, even if every figure in the demand is fair. For Seoul and Tokyo, the effect is the same regardless of the merits. A quiet, corrosive question they had not had to ask in 70 years. If the day comes, will the Americans truly be there? Or will they check the balance first? And once an ally begins asking that question, it begins buying quiet insurance, hedging, courting other partners. In Korea's case, glancing toward the very China it was meant to help hold back. We will see exactly where that leads. The machine built at Camp David was designed to survive the loss of its leaders. It survived that. Now it faced a harder question: whether it could survive being treated not as an alliance, but as a transaction, and whether, in putting a price on protection, its own architect might be quietly draining it of the thing that gave it power. Here is what should have happened next. With the architects gone and a transactional president putting a price on everything, the smart bet was that the spirit of Camp David would quietly die. Not in a dramatic collapse, those are rare, but the ordinary way institutions die. A summit postponed, an exercise scaled back, a joint statement that slowly stops being written. The successors owed the project nothing. Two of them had risen, in one way or another, in opposition to the men who built it. All they had to do to kill it was stop showing up. They kept showing up. This is the part almost no one predicted, because of who these successors were. In Tokyo, Sanae Takaichi, a hardline nationalist, an unlikely friend of Korea. In Seoul, Lee Jae-myung, a progressive who had warned for years that his country was leaning too far toward Japan. On paper, the worst possible pair to keep a Japan-Korea partnership alive. And yet, in January of 2026, the new Korean president flew to Japan and met the new Japanese prime minister in the ancient city of Nara. 4 months later, she flew to Korea to meet him in Andong. They called it hometown shuttle diplomacy, each leader visiting the other's home ground, something the two countries had never once done in their entire modern history. Within 7 months of Takaichi taking office, the two had met 4 times. They signed deals on energy and on supply chains. The relationship that had gone to economic war only a few years earlier was improbably deepening. And the three-way machine kept turning. The foreign ministers met on the sidelines of the world summits, exactly as the schedule demanded, reaffirming the goal of denuclearizing North Korea, coordinating against economic coercion. In July of 2026, the United States, Japan, and Korea went further and signed a joint agreement to cooperate on building and exporting small nuclear reactors together, binding their industries into a shared venture, not only their armies. The exercises sailed on. The calendar held. Step back, and the picture is genuinely surprising. The alliance had lost all 3 of its founders. It was being pressured from above by the very superpower that created it. Its 2 Asian members carried a 100-year-old wound and a fresh trade war between them, and were now led by a nationalist and a progressive who agreed on almost nothing. Every ingredient for collapse was in the pot, and still, the meetings happened. The machine ran. So the architects were right. The bet paid off. Institutions really are stronger than the people who walk away from them. Slow down. Because the meetings happened is not the same thing as the alliance is healthy. A machine can keep turning while something inside it quietly cracks. The summits were real, but so were the fault lines running directly beneath them, and there were 2 of them, widening with every handshake. The first was the oldest wound of all, and it had never truly healed. When Lee Jae-myung and Sanae Takaichi bowed to one another and smiled for the cameras, they were performing a small miracle. And like most miracles, it was thinner than it looked. Beneath the handshakes, the oldest fault line in the alliance had not moved an inch. Remember what stands between these 2 countries: 35 years of colonial rule, forced labor, the comfort women, a treaty the victims themselves never agreed to. That history did not disappear because 2 leaders decided to cooperate. It went quiet, and the 2 people now managing it were, in many ways, the least equipped to lay it to rest. Start with Seoul. Lee Jae-myung had built much of his career as a critic of drawing too close to Japan without a fuller reckoning for the past. As president, he chose pragmatism. He shook the hand. He flew to Nara. He kept the peace. But the underlying Korean demand never vanished. That Japan reckon more honestly, more completely with what was done. When he visited Japan, observers noticed what the warm summits carefully stepped around. The hard questions on history were left in the room, unanswered. The smiles managed the wound. They did not close it. Now look at Tokyo. Sanae Takaichi rose through the most nationalist wing of Japanese politics, a figure long associated with a revisionist view of the country's wartime past, and, in earlier years, a regular visitor to the Yasukuni Shrine, where Japan honors its war dead, among them men convicted as war criminals. To many Koreans, that shrine is the single sharpest symbol of a Japan that has never fully apologized. And here is the detail that shows how fragile all of this is. As Prime Minister, Takaichi held back. She stayed away from the shrine, restrained by diplomacy, by domestic politics, perhaps by pressure from Washington. The nationalist chose, for now, not to strike the match, but sit with what that actually means. The stability of the alliance's Asian pillar now rests on a nationalist leader continuing to bite her tongue, and on a Korean public continuing to accept smiles in place of the deeper apology it has demanded for 80 years. That is not a settlement. It is a truce, and a truce holds only until someone decides it is no longer worth holding. We have already seen how fast this can break. A single shrine visit, a single schoolbook, a single careless line about the colonial era from a Japanese official, any one of these has in the past frozen relations overnight. The forced labor cases are still moving through Korean courts. The remains of some wartime laborers are still being identified and returned to Korean soil. The past is not a closed book here. It is an open wound that the two governments have agreed, for the moment, not to touch. This is the first fault line, and it runs on emotion, on memory, on domestic politics no summit can control. It could crack at any time, but it is not, in the end, the more dangerous of the two. Because the second fault line is not about the past. It is about the future, about which way each of these countries intends to run when the pressure finally comes. And on that question, Seoul and Tokyo are not drifting together. They are moving in opposite directions. The first fault line was about a wound. The second is about a choice. And it is, quietly, the most dangerous crack in the entire alliance. To see it, you have to accept an uncomfortable fact. The three countries do not actually agree on what the alliance is for. For the United States and for Japan, the answer has grown increasingly clear. It is about China, balancing it, deterring it, holding the line against it. And under Sanae Takaichi, Japan stopped being subtle. In November of 2025, she said something in Parliament that no Japanese leader had said in the open since the end of the Second World War. Asked about a Chinese attack on Taiwan, she declared that such a scenario could be a survival-threatening situation for Japan. Words that, under Japanese law, can unlock the use of military force. In a single sentence, she moved Japan from careful ambiguity to an open position. A war over Taiwan could be Japan's war too. Beijing's reaction was fury. It called the remarks dangerous and launched a wave of countermeasures, travel warnings that emptied the flights between the two countries, economic pressure, a diplomatic deep freeze. The episode revealed just how confrontational the Tokyo-Beijing relationship had become. Japan, sitting on the front line, had chosen to meet China's rise head-on. Now turn to Seoul and watch the alliance split down the middle. South Korea does not have Japan's luxury of clarity because South Korea needs China. China is its largest trading partner, the biggest buyer of the exports that drive its economy. A war over Taiwan would be a catastrophe Korea would do almost anything to avoid being pulled into. And Lee Jae-myung was elected precisely as the man who would refuse to let his country be shoved into an anti-China bloc. His instinct is the mirror image of Takaichi's, not confrontation, but balance. Keep the American alliance for security, keep the Chinese market for prosperity, and never, if it can be helped, be forced to choose between them. Watch what that produces in practice. When Japan draws a hard line on Taiwan, Korea steps carefully around the question. When Lee visited Japan, he pointedly declined to be pinned down on a Taiwan contingency. Tokyo is leaning in, Seoul is leaning out, and the United States, the architect of the whole design, wants both of them fully aligned against Beijing. This is the deepest structural weakness in the entire triangle, and it deserves to be said plainly. The alliance was built against shared threats, but its two Asian members no longer share the same threat in the same way. To Japan, China is the danger to be confronted. To Korea, China is the neighbor and the customer to be managed. One is running toward the fire. The other is trying to stay out of the kitchen. You cannot build a durable military alliance on two partners pointed in opposite directions on the single most important question it will ever face. And that question is not hypothetical, because sitting at the exact center of this divide is the one scenario that could force all three of them to show their hand at the same moment. The scenario Takaichi already spoke aloud. Taiwan. If war ever comes there, the alliance's two fault lines, the ghost of history and the split over China, stop being cracks in the foundation. They become the very thing that decides whether the alliance holds or shatters at the exact moment it matters most. That is the trap the next chapter walks straight into. Every alliance has a scenario it is secretly built around, the one it does not like to talk about, because talking about it forces everyone to admit what they would actually do. For this one, that scenario has a name: Taiwan. Here is why it is the ultimate test. A war over Taiwan would not politely stay in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan sits about 100 miles from Japan's southernmost islands and astride the shipping lanes that carry Japan's and Korea's oil. American forces fighting to defend it would launch from bases in Japan and could draw on the 28,500 troops stationed in Korea. In one stroke, a conflict over an island that neither Japan nor Korea governs could pull both of them into the largest war in Asia since 1945. This is not a footnote to the alliance. For a growing number of planners in Washington, it is quietly becoming the main event, and it lands on the two Asian allies in completely different ways. For Japan, the answer is already half-spoken. Takaichi said it out loud. A Taiwan contingency could be a survival-threatening situation, the legal trigger for Japan to fight. Japan is the front line. Its bases would be indispensable. Its islands would be in range. Tokyo has, in effect, already begun to accept that a war for Taiwan could be its war. For Korea, the question is agony, and it has spent years trying not to answer it. Follow the trap. The American troops in Korea were sent there for one reason: North Korea. But the United States increasingly wants the freedom to use those forces for more than the peninsula, a concept called strategic flexibility, on the table between the two countries since 2006. If a Taiwan war erupts, Washington may want to move part of that force, or use those bases for the fight. And that confronts Seoul with a nightmare in three parts. First, entanglement. If Korea lets American forces launch a Taiwan operation from its soil, it has effectively declared itself a combatant against China, the neighbor that buys its exports and sits on its border. Second, abandonment. If those American troops leave the peninsula to fight over Taiwan, what is left to deter the enemy right next door? And third, the scenario that keeps Korean generals awake, the dual contingency. What if North Korea, watching America pour its attention and its forces toward Taiwan, chooses that exact moment to move? A war for Taiwan could become the opening North Korea has waited 70 years for. So Korea does the only thing it can. It refuses to answer. Its leaders decline to say what they would do. They keep the language vague, the commitments unwritten, the question firmly open. And you can understand why. But strategic ambiguity is a luxury that lasts only until the missiles fly. On the day of a Taiwan crisis, silence is not an option. Seoul would be forced, within hours, to make the very choice it has spent decades avoiding: America or China, entanglement or abandonment in front of the entire world. This is the trap at the center of the alliance. The two fault lines we traced, the ghost of history and the split over China, both run straight into Taiwan and detonate. Japan leans in, Korea holds back, America expects both. A partnership that looks solid in the calm of a summit could discover, in the first hour of a real war, that its three members had never actually agreed on the one question that mattered most. And there is a reason none of them can simply walk away to safety. A set of chains binding these economies together, even as the politics pull them apart. Those chains are made of silicon. If the military alliance is held together by fear, there is a second alliance underneath it, held together by something else entirely, the most important product on Earth: the semiconductor. Almost nothing in the modern world runs without advanced chips. Not phones, not cars, not weapons, not artificial intelligence. And by an accident of history, the ability to make the most advanced ones sits almost entirely inside this exact group of allies. Taiwan builds the majority of the world's most cutting-edge chips. South Korea dominates the memory chips that every device needs. Japan makes the specialized materials and machines without which none of it is possible. Together, with the United States designing and the Netherlands supplying critical equipment, they hold something close to a monopoly over the technology that will define the next century. Washington has spent years trying to turn that monopoly into a weapon. The logic is simple. If advanced chips are the engine of both economic and military power, then denying them to China slows its rise. So the United States assembled an informal chip alliance, sometimes called the Chip Four, pulling in Korea, Japan and Taiwan to choke off the flow of the most advanced semiconductor technology to Beijing. On paper, this is the alliance at its most powerful: shared industry, shared leverage. A united front on the one technology China cannot yet master. But look closer, and the same silicon that binds them is also cutting them apart. Here is the problem. South Korea's giant chip makers do not only sell to the West, they run enormous factories inside China. When Washington moved to revoke the special permissions that let Samsung and SK Hynix operate those Chinese plants, it was not striking at China. It was striking at Korean companies, ordering them, in effect, to choose between the American alliance and the Chinese market that a huge share of their business depends on. This is the divide from before, now in physical form. The same split over China running straight through Korea's most important industry. And then there is the price of belonging. The same American administration demanding that allies pay more for their defense is also using tariffs, and the threat of tariffs, to pull the chip industry itself onto American soil. Faced with a choice between building in the United States or being taxed out of its market, Korea's and Taiwan's chip champions have begun committing tens of billions of dollars to American factories. Japan is pouring more than 10 trillion yen into building a domestic chip industry of its own. To Washington, this is winning, bringing the crown jewels home. To an ally, it can feel like being quietly stripped by your own protector. Your factories, your technology, your future, relocated under pressure to the very country that is also billing you for your defense. So the semiconductor is the perfect emblem of this entire alliance. It is, at the same moment, the strongest glue and the sharpest friction. It gives the three countries a shared interest no summit could ever invent, a common industry, a common rival, a common stake in staying aligned. And in the very same motion, it forces the exact question the alliance keeps trying to dodge. How much of your prosperity and how much of your independence are you willing to hand over to stay under the American umbrella? Chips pull them together and push them apart in a single gesture. Fear on top, silicon underneath, both holding the alliance together and both straining it. And into that already loaded structure comes one more force. The wild card no one at Camp David fully planned for, a partnership of the desperate taking shape on the other side. Every chapter so far has been about the three allies, their history, their fears, their divisions. But an alliance is never tested in a vacuum. It is tested by its enemies. And while Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo argued over invoices and dodged the question of Taiwan, their adversaries were building something of their own. In June of 2024, North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense treaty, a promise to come to each other's aid if either is attacked. Two of the most heavily sanctioned, most isolated states on the planet, formally bound together. And this was no paper friendship. Within months, North Korea did something it had never done in its entire history. It sent its soldiers abroad to fight in someone else's war. An estimated 15,000 North Korean troops deployed to Russia and were thrown into the grinding front lines of the war in Ukraine, some in direct combat. Why would Kim Jong-un spend his own soldiers' lives for Moscow? Because of what comes back the other way. In exchange for its troops and its artillery shells, North Korea is receiving from Russia exactly the things it has wanted for decades and could never build alone. Hard cash, food and fuel to steady the regime. And most alarming of all, advanced military technology, help with satellites, with submarines, and with the missile and re-entry technology that could carry North Korea's nuclear arsenal from a crude threat to a genuinely modern one. Remember the doubt from earlier in this story, that North Korea's warheads had never been proven able to survive the flight to a distant target. This is the partnership that could erase that doubt. Russia has the knowledge North Korea lacks, and a war debt to pay it with. Now set this beside everything else. The authoritarian side of the equation is consolidating. North Korea and Russia fused by a treaty and a war, with China looming behind them as the economic giant that keeps the whole bloc afloat. The democratic side, the three allies, is the one arguing about money, divided over China, and dodging the question of Taiwan. And here is the strange twist. A threat like this is exactly what the alliance was built to face. In theory, a strengthening enemy axis should be the best thing that could happen to trilateral unity. Nothing binds allies together like a shared danger growing more dangerous. This axis should be the fear that overrides the history and the divisions, just as North Korea's missiles once drove these old enemies to Camp David in the first place. But it cuts both ways, because the same axis sharpens the very divide that splits the allies. A stronger, Russian-backed North Korea terrifies Seoul above all. It is the gun aimed directly at Korea's head, and it pulls Korea's attention back toward its own border and away from Taiwan and China. Japan, further from the North Korean threat and fixed on China, keeps its eyes on the strait. The rising external danger that should unite them instead risks pointing each of them at a different enemy, Korea to the north, Japan to the west. The wild card, in other words, does not resolve the alliance's contradictions. It sharpens them. It raises the stakes on every question the three have been avoiding. And it all but guarantees that when the reckoning finally comes, it will come harder. So after all of it, the wound, the machine, the price, the fault lines, the trap, the axis, we arrive at the only question left. What actually happens to this alliance now? An alliance under this much pressure does not have one future. It has several, and which one arrives depends on choices not yet made. Strip away the detail, and three roads open in front of the United States, Japan, and South Korea. The first road is the one the architects dreamed of. Call it the pillar. On this path, the machine built at Camp David does exactly what it was designed to do. The routine holds. The fear of a rising authoritarian axis outweighs the old wounds and the new divisions. Year by year, the summits and the exercises and the shared industries harden into something permanent. Not quite a NATO, but a genuine institutional alliance that outlives any single leader in any of the three capitals. The bet pays off. Institutions prove stronger than politics. And Asia gains an anchor of democratic power that neither a transactional America nor a divided Korea can shake loose. The second road is quieter and in some ways sadder. Call it the hollowing. On this path, nothing dramatic happens at all. There is no rupture, no betrayal, no collapse. The summits keep taking place, but they mean a little less each year. The joint statements grow longer as the substance grows thinner. America keeps sending its invoices. Korea keeps hedging toward China. Japan keeps leaning the other way. And the alliance slowly becomes a shell. Real on paper, empty underneath. It does not die. It just stops mattering, one unkept promise at a time, until a crisis arrives and reveals there was nothing solid left inside. The third road is the one no one wants to say aloud. Call it the rupture. On this path, one of the fault lines finally gives way at the worst possible moment. A war over Taiwan forces the question Korea refuses to answer, and the three split in the open. Or a history crisis between Seoul and Tokyo freezes the relationship just as the missiles begin to fly. Or an American president decides an ally has not paid enough and simply walks away, and a guarantee that held for 70 years dissolves in a single afternoon. This is the road where the whole structure shatters at the exact moment it is needed most. Which road wins? It turns on a handful of variables we have watched the entire way. Whether deterrence can survive being priced, whether history stays buried, whether Seoul and Tokyo can ever point the same direction on China, whether Taiwan stays quiet, and whether the country that built the alliance still believes in it. Which brings us back to where we began, to the promise made on that hillside in Maryland, and the word underneath it, leader-proof. The architects believed they had built something that could survive anything, even the loss of themselves. And the astonishing thing is that, so far, against every expectation, they have been partly right. The alliance lost all three of its founders. It absorbed a transactional turn. It weathered a nationalist and a progressive at its Asian core. And it is still standing. But still standing is not the same as safe. What Camp David really built was not a fortress. It was a machine that keeps running only as long as three governments keep choosing to run it. And each of them now has a powerful reason to reconsider. Leader-proof was never a guarantee. It was a bet, and the world is still waiting to see if it pays off. Because this alliance is about more than three countries. It is the clearest test we have of whether the American-led order that shaped the last 80 years can survive the pressures of the next. If it holds, that order still has a future in Asia. If it hollows out or breaks, we will know that something has ended, not with a war, but with an invoice, a grudge, and 3 allies who could not decide in time whether they were truly on the same side. The test is still running, and all of us are still living inside the question.